Every week, Surfing the MASH Tsunami brings you three major stories from the world of steatotic liver disease. This weekend, we are bringing you each of those stories separately so you can listen during a shorter, discrete period of time. Hope you enjoy them.
For the last 5 years, MASLD stakeholders, whether manufacturers, trial sites, providers, payers, patients, or investors, have turned to Surfing the MASH Tsunami to keep track of drug and device development, epidemiology, public health initiatives, and practice patterns. This weekend, we are sharing the three main sections from our episode 3. Roger will provide more information after these notes from our sponsors.
Surfing the MASH Tsunami is sponsored by these healthcare-related organizations.
Madrigal Pharmaceuticals, Inc. is a biopharmaceutical company focused on delivering novel therapeutics for metabolic dysfunction-associated steatohepatitis, or MASH, a liver disease with high unmet medical need. Madrigal's medication, Rezdiffra, resmetirom, is a once-daily oral liver-directed THR beta agonist designed to target key underlying causes of MASH. Rezdiffra is the first and only medication approved by the FDA for the treatment of MASH with moderate to advanced fibrosis, consistent with stages F2 to F3. An ongoing Phase 3 outcomes trial is evaluating Rezdiffra for the treatment of compensated MASH cirrhosis, consistent with stage F4C. For more information, visit www.madrigalpharma.com.
LiverRight and the LiverRight Scanning Network. On April 15th, 2025, LiverRight will open America's first virtual specialty clinic for liver disease, offering adults in all 50 states video appointments and helping GI practices and health systems triage and treat the swelling numbers of patients seeking MASLD and MASH testing. LiverRight offers same-week video visits and accepts insurance. For more information, contact LiverRight, that's liver, and then RIGHT at www.liverright.com.
Tawazun Health, your partner in global liver health innovation. At Tawazun Health, we specialize in providing small or large-scale access to FibroScan examinations for liver health-focused early detection, clinical trials, independent research, and collaborative projects with clinicians and FibroScan providers increasingly throughout the world. As industry-leading experts, we design and deliver high-quality FibroScan services because we know that accurate, high-quality, reliable data drives better outcomes. To learn about our sister lifestyle app, mylife365.me, click the Tawazun Health link on the Surfing MASH homepage.
This week, our expert is Jeff McIntyre, Vice President of Liver Programs at the Global Liver Institute. Jeff and I talk about two things. First, we talk at some length about the implications of the recent layoffs and reductions of high-level staff at FDA and NIH. As Jeff points out, we don't know how this is going to work, but what we do know is that with fewer seasoned hands on board, there will be more mistakes, things will take longer, and he cites a couple of examples that have already been demonstrated. We then go on to talk a little bit about FibroSIGHT, a product he has looked at as well. Jeff describes it as a really good product for right now because it will provide benefit, but that over time he has concern that it will lead to more folks requiring biopsies, well, folks meaning payers, and as a result, more biopsies to be done, and that will depress patient demand, as I anticipate it might.
And now, here's Roger and Jeff McIntyre with today's expert segment.
So because timing is everything, our expert this week is Jeff McIntyre, our good friend from Global Liver Institute. Jeff and I, in fact, we're chatting for a few minutes before we turn this on about all the reasons that having Jeff on today is an excellent idea, and none of them have to do with the fact that it's April Fool's Day per se. Jeff, do you have an April Fool's prank in your life today?
Oh, I think I could point to many things that I wish I could, credit as being for April Fools, but I think I'm the April Fool. I think that's what it is in my life. I'm the April Fool.
But that could be any of us. We all could read the front page of the papers today, particularly if you're in healthcare, and say, oh God, that's the funniest thing I've ever seen in my life, except then you realize it's not funny. It's just exactly what's happening. So we're going to do two things in this conversation. Number one is we're going to talk about April Fool's Day, or if you will, April 1st, and everything that we've seen in the last couple of days around policy and Washington, and preliminary think about what might it mean for fatty liver disease, steatotic liver disease, what might it mean for the drugs in development, what might it mean for patients, what might it mean for all of that. And then second, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the subject that was covered in the interview that folks heard right before this with Yukti Chaudhry from HistoIndex talking about FibroSIGHT, which is, I think, really an interesting product in several different ways. Some good, some just interesting, but all that. So why don't we start with April 1st? let's recap what all has happened today. I'm going to ask you to recap it, what's happened in Washington today, because you're closer to it than I have, and I haven't looked in the newspaper for 5 hours.
Well, it's a continuation of what's been happening ever since the new administration came in. I mean, President Trump came in with promises of drastically reshaping the government and is well on his path to do that. I mean, it started with a flurry of executive actions his very first day in office, and then we've seen it spread out. It feels like on the given week is when the emphasis is going to be. I've got friends in the Forest Service. They went through their layoffs. I've seen friends in the agriculture had the same thing there. And now we're seeing this week much more concentrated stuff around HHS. Specifically, I've seen announcements around FDA and HRSA. And so it's concerning. I think there's a real concern that in this chopping down of the government tree, if you will, about kind of what happens. The immediacy is what is the impact on those most affected, the government workers, the people that are local, they're trying to sustain their families. I think there's an immediate impact. It's certainly felt here in the Washington region. But then there's also the impact of what happens when you don't have that sort of career wisdom or career experience in place to help guide the day-to-day conversations and the directions on this. Some even point to the text messaging episode with Hegseth and some of the others around Yemen that had career employees been in place, they would have never been on those phones to begin with. That's a sort of basic thing of use this phone, not that phone. And so if we blow that up to a larger scale for our conversation, I think we've got a real question about what happens with drug approval process. I think we have a real question of what happens with clinical trial oversight. I think we have a real question about drug safety in the procedures. I think anything and everything that the FDA has done in the past is suddenly going to have a question mark behind it that we're just not going to know until we know. And even when we know, it may be a very different color than what it's been in the past. And in our previous conversation, you mentioned Rob Califf's statement about what we used to know of the FDA is no more. And I think that's a fair statement. That is what the promise that was made, is that government agencies would no longer be what they used to be. And we've seen that with USAID completely getting obliterated, and now Department of Education is on its way out. Those have been a lot of the headlines in the healthcare field. I think we're really going to see that there's an immediate impact, but I think we're going to be seeing the consequences of it much, much longer down the road. We haven't had the impact in infectious disease. We haven't had a SARS. We haven't had a COVID, and the inability to respond to that, because of the decisions made. So this is just the immediate stuff. And I think getting further out is really going to take some prognostication to kind of see what the implications are. And unfortunately, most of it's pretty pessimistic, I think, right now.
So when last we had this conversation on this podcast, it was November, and you said, well, we don't know. I think now we know what's been said. We don't know what will be done. Now we know what's been done or what's being done.
What we are seeing is the first quarter of what's being done. Thinking of it as an American football game, we see the first quarters. They're still setting the field for what's going to be done. And I truly believe that we just haven't seen the consequences. You get rid of the Department of Education. Well, what happens to Head Start? Well, that goes away. Then what's the consequence of not having Head Start in the world? What's the consequence of not having people in place to run a quicker drug approval program at the FDA? Well, we haven't got to that place of consequence yet. We just see all the mechanisms being put in place for it.
Oh, but we will. Are those the mechanisms that are being in place, or are those the mechanisms that are being casually destroyed? I mean, you think about that Elon story, right? About he realized that someone did away with, I forget which disease it was, but he did away with everything in the government that was fighting the disease. So he simply erased what he did away with and undid it and invited people back to work. There's a real casualness about this. It's like these guys don't understand what they're playing with.
Well, I think that was Ebola that they were speaking about, that they gotten rid of everybody on that and then they tried to rehire them. But that's been the case in several aspects where they've gone in, there's an infamous moment very much memed of him coming up on stage at the Conservative Political Action Committee at CPAC with a chainsaw.
Right.
And that's apropos, man. He's just running through the crowd with a chainsaw right now and then figuring they'll hire people back. And this is unfortunately not new. He did the same thing at Twitter.
Right.
When he bought it and has now since sold it again. But that it's just you get everybody out and then you hand select the people that are coming in. And I think one of the things that is not spoken about in this is optimistically, And we those of us that like to be optimistic and have some hope in our lives, there will come a better day where we will have an administration that is more prioritized towards health, more prioritized towards prevention, the things that the values that we hold to help patients especially. And that's going to be a big battle that we're set up for now, is trying to reinstate or trying to address some of these programs, because all of them are going to go back to, is it worth the money? And so we're going to be fighting these battles on two fronts, one right now, one in the future as well.
So if you happen to live in a disease category like, say, fatty liver, MASH, where the scientific dam has broken and mechanisms of action are coming to fore that actually appear to work and help, and you're in various stages of clinical trials, what's the best you can hope for, say, if you're a patient?
That's a great question, Roger. Well, the mechanism is broken with the approval of resmetirom. We see that's out there, and we're fortunate that it broke through when it did, because it has now allowed us being the patient community and those aligned with us, to identify and kind of run the traps on the rest of the pathway. And we've seen that there are traps and things in the rest of the pathway there, because we've got issues with reimbursement, we've got issues with payers, we've seen especially issues at the Veterans Administration. Those are the things that are good for us to be able to engage, and we will continue to engage and fight those battles. To my knowledge, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think we've got two other potential therapies that are queued up that should go through the approval process sometime in the next year or two. Timeline kind of is open to that. I think the question for that is, will that timeline still hold? We've seen even at the CDC that there was a coding meeting for the ICD-10 coding that was supposed to happen in March. My understanding is they just didn't have the personnel. They let everything go. People were confused. That hearing was it was postponed, then it was postponed, and then it was canceled, and now we're doing everything in an October meeting. So we'll be doing twice as much of that October meeting.
Yeah, 6 months later, right.
Yeah, and so there's a delay there in terms of being able to get the appropriate coding for things like fibrosis, which GLI is put in for. And so I think that's going to be analogous to everywhere else. Will drug approvals go through at the same rate? Nobody knows. Will accelerated approval still be a thing? Nobody knows. I think there was a little bit of a question mark around that already. And now with this administration coming in with so many shenanigans, it's just kind of hard to tell where it is. I think if there is hope to point towards, some high potential in this, is that while we've had mechanisms that have gotten through, there's also been a real rise and a real great conversation and push around, especially for fatty liver, around the GLP-1s. And so I think that there is a potential for, even though if they're not specifically geared towards treatment of liver, there are still the possibility it could be perhaps written off script, or there are treatment options, because so many, as we know, fatty liver patients present with co-occurring conditions, that there are still some pathways available there. They may not be the ways that we have hoped we could rely on the government for. And so that raises the importance of patient advocacy and groups like GLI and liver education advocates and the other patient advocacy groups, is to make sure that patients are aware of their options, that they're empowered, that they understand the payer sort of environment, and can make the right connections to make sure that their pathways are clear for their best treatment.
So listening to you, one of the things that strikes me is it's not clear whether we need to work around the government or against the government.
I don't think those are mutually exclusive right now.
I think that's fair.
I think that we have to find the opportunities to work with the government. We know as a patient organization, for instance, that, if you fire all the scientists, for instance, that are working in an area and you move clinical trials somewhere else, that's what you're doing. You're just moving it else. And so where do you want it to be? Do you want the scientists and the research to be in the US, or do you want it to be in China? Do you want it to be Southeast Asia? Do you want to be in Latin America? There are other places. I've seen stuff come through about, where they're looking to hire scientists fired in this way. And so it's going to continue to a certain extent. It's just not the most efficient and not ideal, and it's overly politicized right now as well. And so I think what it presents to us is we have to find these places where we can present our argument. This is the constituency that this administration promised to help. I think there are still bridges to be built there, but in the meantime, if they're not going to do the job, then patient advocacy groups are going to stand up and be there for their patients.
How much does MAHA concern you in all this? MAHA, for those who don't know, being Bobby's initiative to make America healthy again, which is basically all the fraudulent stuff.
Yeah, it's a hell of a bumper sticker, isn't it? Really, I'll give them credit on the politics of it, as they really captured a turn of the phrase there on that. The thing about MAHA that is so frustrating is that there are certain aspects of legitimacy in the idea. Yeah, we'd like America to be healthy. We'd love to do more prevention. It's kind of like saying to be against that's like, being for child abuse or domestic violence. It's just like, who's going to argue with making America healthy again? Even more so than making America great again. That's even more innocuous than that. But I think when you get into the details, it's really, really concerning. I don't know that you do that by firing 40% of HRSA or by letting most of the FDA go and the career expertise with that. And we have seen when it comes especially to the food and nutrition part of that, which I tend to be particularly cued in on, is that what they have started off with their MAHA commission is they've identified and are working on infant formula. And so who's going to argue about making infant formula more healthy, about taking artificial and processed stuff out of infant formula, although infant formula by its very nature is a processed food. And so you can't say that you're going to make this processed food better while also getting rid of processed foods, but it will also set a precedent for how they adapt and deal with other things, I think. And so there's a high level of suspicion around everything, but the other thing that this administration, at least in its previous term, was known for was a whole lot of hype and not a lot of follow through. And I think it's fair to say that, they've often called this a shock and awe sort of process. And the issue with shock and awe, if you remember from the Iraq invasion and, when it was first quoted, wasn't the shock and awe, it was the inability to follow through and to make anything happen afterward, to be able to provide sustainability, to provide, a common, interest of a platform, to be able to provide democracy. And that's where the concern is in this, is they're going to shock and awe the hell out of the U.S. government, but do they have the expertise and the wisdom to be able to help us once they've clear-cut their way through this forest?
I think that's well put and an excellent perspective. But it scares me a little bit more in MAHA because a lot of the people that Bobby is surrounding himself with are people whose definition of making America healthy really don't have a lot to do with making America healthy.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that, Roger. I think, they certainly don't have an evidence base. In some instances, we've seen some of the members that have essentially been influential podcasters or people with nutrition startups, that they'll have a grain of truth that they can step on, a grain of evidence. But then when taken to the breadth of the issue that they have to deal with, it really collapses on its own weight.
Yeah, and then, as you say, politically, it's really attractive.
Yeah, absolutely. Who doesn't want to make America healthy again?
And by the way, just a note, somebody has come on this podcast frequently in the past and railed against the food industrial complex.
I can't imagine. Who would have thought that, we've got this new administration that's essentially quoting many of the same sort of slogans and bumper stickers that we saw in the Let's Move, movement from the Obama administration. The thing that's interesting about that, though, is that there is a legitimate argument. I don't necessarily agree with it 100%, but there's a legitimate argument that Let's Move was not as successful as it could have been, that it was a lot of PSAs and whatnot. And so that's kind of where the expectation is around MAHA, except MAHA is also combined with this just clear cutting of jobs and programs and services, which really runs in the face of this. We've never done prevention well in the U.S. We've done public health prevention well with seatbelts and cigarette smoking, and some would say parts of the COVID response. But cigarettes and seatbelts were either due to legislation or due to lawsuits. And if that's what it takes, this administration is not going to be the one that does that.
So let's put the most optimistic spin we can on what we're talking about right now. What would that look like? Or is that merely the least pessimistic spin, first of all? Is there a legitimately optimistic spin to put on all this right now, the way it looks?
I think so. Have hope in your providers. Have good conversations with them. Reach out to the patient advocate groups. Empower yourself. I've always been a little bit of a DIY person myself anyway. And so this is the opportunity. If you weren't motivated to take better care of your health and be on top of this, there are organizations like the Global Liver Institute that are out there ready to help inform and support and fight these battles. And we have partnerships with groups that we can set you up with. We have an entire liver action network that is spread throughout the U.S. and is beginning to grow globally as well, to be able to help answer the questions you've got. If you put all of your faith into one thing and see that one thing collapse, whether it's the government or a pill or whatever it is, then the optimism comes in seeing that there are others around you going through the same thing and that there are more resources available to be able to help you be able to address this.
Excellent point. Along with which, I will go back to one of the most important, although not necessarily the way people had in mind, statements ever made on this podcast was the question Mike Charlton asked 4 years ago about who's going to be the Larry Kramer of NASH. Do we need that now?
I don't think so. I mean, I gotta say, the environment in which Larry Kramer came about, and I don't want to say prospered, but in which he energized the base that he was working with and made the changes happen, is just such a radically different thing today. If Larry Kramer existed in the land of Twitter and Facebook and misinformation, I think it's a very different thing that he has as he goes forward. He was the right person at the right time to do the right thing when he did his piece. Today, as politics is set up, as society is set up, as the world is set up, we have to be more collaborative. We have to be, working together to make the right things happen. And so, the FDA gets into all sorts of goofiness with this clear cutting of jobs. And so now we take a look at the EMA. Maybe that it steps up in Europe, that we can begin to emphasize that. Maybe we build bridges with other patient organizations, with other more industry patient organizations sort of partnerships. I think that it's never bad to have an outspoken voice out there demanding change, but this is an era where we have to stick together and have to be collaborative as opposed to having just that one dynamo out there as the tip of the spear.
Okay. With that noted, where outside of the patient advocate community should patients or providers be looking right now for kindred spirits and mutual support?
From a patient perspective, that goes to your community. Whatever gives you comfort, that's the right choice. To me, whatever makes you comfortable, that's the right choice. Certainly, there are some bad choices in what makes people comfortable, but, in the immediacy, that's it. GLI set up with a ton of resources. I think having a strong connection with your provider and being able to talk with them. My experience, and I don't mean to be a homer for this, but my experience with many of the pharmaceutical companies that are looking at these products, they have been a good place for information on stuff, and they have even been willing to help individuals with things such as, obtaining the prescription that they need, working against stuff. We found that especially in the case of the Veterans Administration. And so I don't think you want to limit yourself necessarily. If your spirit is troubled and church is a place that you can go to get a peace of mind, to be able to take a breath in order to be able to then readdress the next day's challenges, then by all means, church, mosque, temple, whatever it is, if it's time with your dog, if it's, the support groups that we have and that other groups have as well, it's mostly important that folks know they're not alone in this. And we had a real issue with this with NASH back in the day as it was. We have patients that show up at our Advanced Advocacy Academy every year and say that they've never met anyone else with fatty liver disease, but prevalence figures of that are going towards 1 in 3 right now. And so I think don't be alone.
Good. I think that's a great guidance on which to end. And the one thought I have going way back is, 40 years ago, before HIV, everything got approved in Europe first because the FDA was entirely organized around not producing thalidomide. So everything went to Europe first. And then there was a period in the late 80s, early 90s, where that just turned around. And we've been living in the turned around world ever since. So we don't know what this will be, I guess.
Well, and I would say, too, that Mexico just announced a streamlining and a clearer pathway for their clinical trials as well. And so we may see, since, as you said, the 80s and 90s, we traditionally saw it go FDA, EMA, and then into other countries. But I think we may begin to see some rearrangement of that, and we're set up to support that.
Okay. Excellent. So with that, let's shift gears a little bit. Okay, let's go to our other topic, which is FibroSIGHT. I have some common understanding of what it does, and I think you did a very nice job of describing that in her interview earlier today.
Yeah, thank you. Well, HistoIndex came out with a big announcement on approval for FibroSIGHT. It's I guess you've talked about this earlier in the episode as well, but it's, this technology that is a non-staining stain of sorts, if you will. It uses lasers to be able to promote and identify where fibrosis is. Their website's got a couple of really cool graphics on it for folks to check out if they're interested in that. What's interesting about this is that we have a technological advance that I think will be helpful for patients, but it is from biopsy-derived samples. And so, as we said earlier in our conversation, Roger, this is exactly where we should be and where we should not be at the same time. There's a real catch-22 with this. When you consider biopsy, yeah, it's awesome. We should be in a place where we can promote and support innovation in the field for those that have had a biopsy. And better information, better data. We've seen a lot of improvements over AI, for instance, in identifying some of this stuff as well. Totally promote it. It's going to be be helpful for a certain population. But I think the reality behind this is it still doesn't address the basic issue around biopsy and diagnosis, frankly, as well, which goes to biopsy being still the standard. And that's a problem. If we had a more neutral sort of endpoints as the standard for diagnosis, if you will, for drug approval, specifically with the FDA, then you would see a lot more non-invasives come in to be able to meet those endpoints and not be relying on biopsy so much. We'll never be completely rid of biopsy. There's still going to be a certain small need for that. But I think the issue with the FibroSIGHT, as great as it is and as innovative as it is, frankly, is it's not going to scale. It is limited by biopsy itself, which has limitations built into it as well.
So define the nature of the limitations of biopsy as you see them.
Well, not to be glib, but they suck.
Don't sugarcoat it, Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, who signs up for a biopsy for a weekend, escape? The biopsies are not fun. They've gotten a lot better, but at the end of the day, biopsies are painful. You run a risk of infection. There's bleeding involved. It's something that patients only want to do as a last resort towards diagnosis or treatment. And so the notion that people would have to do it repeatedly in a clinical trial or as a reliable method, say, of management or screening, is just not effective. Patients are always going to be resistant to it. It is a procedure, and as such, it can't be done as efficiently as some of the non-invasives are done. So you've got the patient identification and the patient risk. They don't want to because it sucks. It's painful, bleed out, infection, all the things there. But then you've also got this pragmatic side to it as well, is that if we can use some of the non-invasive technologies that I've seen that are beginning to emerge, those are things that might be able to be more easily scaled to populations that are going to be more in need of it. So we're serving more patients that way, but it's also a business model that allows us to be able to have a larger audience for services that are going to be able to be diagnosed, but also be able to be served and have their liver disease addressed.
That sounds right. I mean, kind of my reaction talking to Yukti earlier today was I think not so different from that. It's a good thing to have, and they intend to bring out more product behind it to do some really exciting things, like tell you which drug is likely to work in which patient. But the problem is that if you limit it to biopsy, then you're going to really reduce the scale of patient population you can treat in a world where 1 out of every 3 people has Mausel and maybe 15% of them. If you're assessing for F1 versus F2, which is the example that Yukti gave this morning, that's a lot of people. And I understand why it's attractive. It's attractive to payers because F1 should not be on Resdifra and F2 should be on Resdifra.
There is no bright red line, their imagery aside. There's no bright red line that distinguishes F2 from F3 or F1 from F2 necessarily. You want to treat F2 and definitely are treating F3. And this sort of technology could conceivably help you do that. But again, it's a limited population. It especially makes me nervous to hear about it. It could help with drug efficacy, because it's not, then what they're saying is it's not the technology that will help with it, but it's that repeated biopsies will help with drug efficacy, and that's just not going to be the case.
I don't think that's their point. Okay, I think frankly their point is if you take a look at some stuff we talked about last year after seeing their stuff, if you can map where in the liver fibrosis is worst, then you can figure out which drugs attack which zones of the liver more effectively. And now you're not in repeated biopsy, you're in trying to get it right. You're trying to get the first decision right fast.
That's a fair statement, and I'll give them credit for that. No question about that. I think I'm still conservative enough to think that there's still going to be biopsy in that patient's future, based on this. Because even if they've identified, one of the things that we know about biopsy is the issue with sample error. You just may not get the right sample out of it. And if they are lucky enough to do it, then I think there's going to be a need for confirmation of that as well, which would only be done by biopsy.
That makes sense. What all this is about, I think, at the end of the day, is it winds up being a rate-limiting technology in terms of how many patients can get treated, but it means that the ones who get treated probably get treated better.
Absolutely. I think that's a great read on it as well. Absolutely necessary, probably not sufficient, but the people that have qualified for it, that have the biopsy, I love that the technology is still evolving. I think we have a lot of excitement around this sort of laser technology, which HistoIndex uses. I think if you kind of layer on the stuff going on with AI that we're seeing with the large larger samples. I mean, it's a really exciting area seeing what can be done with that. But the issue for fatty liver patients specifically starts way before that. It starts with screening and management of their disease, and I just don't see this as being as relevant to the larger populations, again, that can be then scaled and used, hopefully even in other countries as well.
Okay, makes sense. What else should we talk about briefly before we go? As we noted before we got on the line, I refuse to talk about English football. In the absence of Jimmy Johnson and Jeff Jordan, it's going to be hard to get people who aren't native NASCAR followers to understand what's going on in NASCAR. So I think we're dead on sports. Anything else of interest?
Yeah. I guess so. I think by the time you take Tottenham and Hendrick Motorsports away, then we're at loss of male conversation, aren't we?
No, we've always got restaurants, but we're not going to do that on this, right? Okay.
Well, we do have. I think one of the other things I would highlight here, Roger, is we have some exciting stuff going on globally on this, which is that I've been spending a lot of time and working on getting SLD, getting MASLD and MASH, or steatototic liver disease, recognized as a NCD by the WHO as part of the NCD agenda for 2030, I think it is. And so we have a side event coming up. We had a successful side event last year in Geneva with the WHO. We have another one planned this year as part of the WHO, which will be a week after EASL. And we're feeling good about stuff. I mean, this is a great example of, when you talk about the Trump administration going through everything with a chainsaw right now, they have withdrawn from the World Health Organization completely. And there's a lot of concern. I think there's a lot of legitimate danger in that. But in the meantime, groups like GLI are stepping up to try to ensure that patient needs are being addressed. And so we have a campaign and things that we're working on in partnership with other medical societies and other patient groups to really push SLD to get recognized as a non-communicable disease as part of the NCD agenda at the WHO and then eventually at the UN as well.
Okay, and that's exciting and important, and we'll be tracking all that as the year goes along. Thank you, my friend. Looking forward to being in touch soon. I'd love to have you back on at some point at the end of May, early June to talk about after EASL in Geneva, what we got and how all that's worked out.
On behalf of the surfers, our guests, and our sponsors, Madrigal Pharmaceuticals, Liver Right, and Tawas in Health, thanks for joining us this week.
Please join us again next week when we conclude our roundtable on the Emerging Trends Conference, while our newsmakers and experts explore current issues and major ideas.
And until next week, stay safe, surf on, and we'll see you on the podcast. Bye-bye now.